I need to start from the beginning because people keep asking me why any of this matters. They look at the report, a single word, typed in block capital letters, sitting in the middle of an otherwise blank results field, and they think it's a malfunction. They think someone made a mistake. They think maybe the machine was broken that day, or the power fluctuated, or one of the junior technicians misread the output. They weren't there. I was. My name is Vrethna. I am a third caste Centaurian, which means I have 4 arms, mild telepathic sensitivity, and an institutional reputation for being pathologically methodical. I was assigned to Vega Station as a training oversight analyst 3 years before the Marsh incident, which means I have watched more than 900 cadets go through the Fenrir protocol. I know what it looks like when the machine works. I know what it looks like when a cadet breaks down in the chair. I know what it looks like when a cadet laughs nervously, or goes silent, or vomits into the collection basin on the left side of the chamber floor, which happens more often than the official literature suggests. I know all of those things. What I saw that morning was none of them. Let me explain what the Fenrir machine is before I go any further, because most people who have heard the name are working off rumors, and the rumors are, as rumors tend to be, partially accurate in the most useless possible way. The Fenrir Protocol was developed by a joint Centaurian-Velthari research consortium in the year 3031, roughly 13 years before the incident in question. The machine itself is technically called the Psychosensory Mapping Array, Mark IV, but nobody calls it that. The cadets started calling it the Fenrir machine after someone in an early class pointed out that the mythological Fenrir, a great wolf from ancient Norse human mythology, interestingly enough, was a creature that could devour everything, including the gods themselves. The name stuck because it felt right. The machine devours fear, that's its purpose. It maps it, isolates it, quantifies it, and files it away. Here's how it works, technically. The PSMIV uses a combination of neural resonance scanning and low-level empathic projection to identify the primary fear architecture of any sentient being. Different species respond differently to the process. Centaurians experience a mild oscillatory sensation in their primary cortex. Velthari experience a buzzing behind their secondary eye clusters. Krell cadets, the large insected species from the rimward systems, sometimes lose control of their wing flap reflex, which is involuntary and apparently embarrassing, judging by how much the Krell cadets hate talking about it afterward. But regardless of species, regardless of physiology, regardless of individual psychological variation, the machine always produces the same format of output. A primary fear designation, rated on a scale from 1 to 10 in intensity, and a secondary fear matrix that maps related anxieties in descending order of psychological weight. Every sentient species has fears. This is not a controversial statement. Every thinking, feeling mind that has ever sat in the Fenrir chair, the actual physical seat inside the chamber, molded from pressure-responsive polymer so it shapes itself to whatever body you have, has produced a reading within 30 seconds, usually less. The fastest reading in the machine's 11-year operational history was 4 seconds. A Velthari cadet named Esriel Prith, who sat down and immediately began hyperventilating before the scan was even fully activated. The machine had his primary fear cataloged before his own conscious mind had time to name it. The slowest reading before the Marsh incident was 2 minutes 14 seconds. A Centaurian cadet named Yasvel, who later became one of our finest field commanders. He sat very still for 2 minutes and 14 seconds, breathing slowly, clearly trying to maintain composure. The machine eventually got him anyway. Darkness, his report read, not metaphorical darkness, literal darkness, the absence of light. He'd grown up on a station with failing power infrastructure, apparently. The machine found it. It always found it. Until Elias Marsh. Section 1.2, the intake cycle and Cadet Class 7740. The intake cycle that brought Cadet Marsh to Vega Station was Class 7741, a group of 43 cadets representing 17 different species from 12 different systems. Standard composition for a mid-cycle intake. We weren't expecting anything unusual. The class had been processed through medical screening, psychological baseline assessment, species orientation briefings, and the standard first-month training sequence before the Fenrir Protocol was scheduled. The Fenrir Protocol always happens on day 31. This is not arbitrary. 30 days of training is enough time for cadets to form bonds with each other, establish social dynamics, experience stress and sleep deprivation, and the specific grinding anxiety that comes from being evaluated constantly. By day 31, their psychological profiles are somewhat settled. The machine gets cleaner readings. The data is more useful. I had reviewed all 43 incoming psychological baselines the week before the protocol was scheduled. Standard procedure. I was looking for anomalies, cadets who might need additional support, cadets whose baseline profiles suggested significant risk factors, cadets who might have undisclosed conditions that could complicate the process. I flagged 3 cadets for additional monitoring. Cadet Marsh was not among them. His baseline profile was unremarkable, by which I mean it was the profile of a healthy, moderately stressed young human male with no documented phobias, no history of psychological treatment, and anxiety indicators that were well within the normal range for human cadets at the 30-day mark. Slightly below average, actually. He was sleeping adequately. His cortisol analogs were stable. His social integration scores were good. He had friends in the class. He ate his meals. He didn't cause problems. I remember thinking, when I reviewed his file, that he seemed like the kind of cadet who would go through the Fenrir protocol without much drama and produce a clean, legible reading that we could file and move on from. I was wrong in a way I am still, 3 years later, trying to fully understand. I should tell you something about what I knew of Cadet Marsh before the day of the protocol, because the incident doesn't make sense in isolation. Nothing about people makes sense in isolation. Elias Marsh was 23 years old. He was from a place called Meridian Station, not the primary Meridian Station in the Proxima system that most people know, but a smaller secondary installation by the same name in the Kuiper Fringe, the deep outer region of the Sol system. I looked it up after the incident. Meridian Secondary was a small mining and cargo transfer facility. Population around 800, known primarily for producing industrial-grade ice extraction equipment, and for being cold enough that the official environmental briefings for incoming personnel specifically included a note about the psychological effects of extended low-light exposure. He had lived there until he was 18, when he tested into the Galactic Defense Initiative's Accelerated Cadet Program. He'd spent 5 years in pre-cadet preparation, study, physical training, the language integration program that all human cadets went through, before joining Class 7741. His instructors from the pre-cadet program described him with words like steady and reliable and doesn't rattle easily. One of his instructors, a Velthari senior educator named Prethville, had written a short note in the margin of one assessment. This one pays attention to things that other cadets don't notice. Not sure yet if that's a strength or something else. I have thought about that note many times since the incident. Section 1.3, the Protocol Schedule, Class 7741. The Fenrir Protocol for Class 7741 was scheduled across 2 days. Day 31 and Day 32. 22 cadets on Day 31, 21 on Day 32. The order was determined by lottery, a randomized sequence that assigned each cadet a number, and the numbers were drawn in sequence. This is standard. It prevents cadets from going in alphabetical or hierarchical order, which creates performance anxiety in the later scheduled cadets who have too much time to think. Cadet Marsh drew position 19 in the Day 31 sequence. The first 18 cadets went through without notable incident. I say notable because the Fenrir protocol is never entirely undramatic. The machine surfaces things that people don't necessarily want surfaced, and watching 42 people encounter their own fears in sequence is a strange and sometimes moving experience. But nothing in the first 18 sessions was outside the expected range. Cadet Yelenvo, a Krell, produced a reading of open water as her primary fear and cried for about 4 minutes afterward. The wings did flap, as they tend to. Cadet Soph Rendall, a human, produced abandonment and went very quiet and asked to sit alone for a while. Cadet Threx Roman II, a Velthari twin form, produced separate but related readings from each of his 2 cognitive centers, inadequacy and visibility, which is unusual for twin forms, and generated a note from the machine about the psychological tension between the 2 outputs. The technicians found that interesting. None of it was unknown. When Cadet Marsh walked into the chamber, I was observing from the monitoring room. I want to be precise about what I saw. He walked in at a normal pace, not hurried, not hesitant. He looked around the chamber briefly, a single measured visual scan of the room, the equipment, the chair. The kind of look someone gives a new space when they're taking inventory of it. Then he crossed to the chair and sat down. I want to be clear about this. He did not seem nervous, not in any way I could identify, and I am very good at reading physiological stress signals, both because of my training and because of my mild Centaurian empathic sensitivity. There was nothing. No elevated respiration. No tension in the jaw or shoulders. No micro-expressions of anxiety. He sat down, put his hands on the armrests, and looked up at the ceiling. Technician Ola Savarn activated the scan sequence. The machine hummed. The display in the monitoring room began its standard initialization sequence: species profile loading, neural resonance calibration, baseline biometric intake. The biometrics came up normal. Heart rate, 68 beats per minute. Blood pressure, 115/72. Cortisol analogs, 0.14 micrograms per deciliter. Everything within healthy human parameters. Slightly below average resting heart rate for a human in a stress-adjacent situation, but not dramatically so. Some people are just calm. Then the scan began. Part 2, the reading. Section 2.1, 30 seconds. The machine usually delivers its initial reading within the first 30 seconds. This is the phase during which the neural resonance frequency locks onto the subject's primary fear architecture. Most beings feel something during this phase: a mild discomfort, a flash of unwanted memory, a sensation of being watched by something that knows them very well. The response is involuntary. That's the whole point. At 30 seconds, the display in the monitoring room showed processing. This is not unusual at 30 seconds. Sometimes the initial lock takes a little longer. At 45 seconds, the display still showed processing. Ola Savarn looked up from her terminal at that point. I noticed her look up. She glanced at her secondary display, ran a quick diagnostic check on the calibration sequence, found nothing wrong, and looked back at the primary display. Processing. At 60 seconds, she spoke into the intercom. Cadet Marsh, you doing all right in there? His voice came back through the chamber speaker. Yes, ma'am. Clear, even unhurried, like she'd asked him if he was comfortable on a long transit ride. At 1 minute 30 seconds, Technician Dorsal, the senior technician on duty that day, a large and generally unflappable Krell, had moved from his station to stand beside Oles's terminal. He was looking at the display with the particular expression I had come to associate with him, encountering things he couldn't immediately explain. It was a subtle expression, a slight forward lean, a slowing of his mandible movement, which in Krell is roughly equivalent to a human furrowing their brows. At 2 minutes, the display changed. Not to the expected output format, not to a fear designation with a numerical intensity rating and a secondary matrix. The display cleared itself, a complete refresh, unusual and unprompted, which none of us had seen before, and then a single line appeared in the data field. It said, recalibrating. Dorsal said something in Krell that I don't have the translation for, but Oles's expression told me it wasn't a positive statement. Section 2.2, the second attempt. When the machine recalibrates mid-scan, there are exactly 3 documented explanations in the technical literature. First, subject neural architecture is unusual in a way not accounted for by the initial species profile loading, rare, but it happens occasionally with hybrid species cadets. Second, external interference, usually electromagnetic, disrupting the scan quality. Third, the subject is in an active altered state, deep meditation, pharmaceutical sedation, certain forms of dissociative stress response that interferes with normal fear architecture access. Dorsal checked for electromagnetic interference first. Nothing. The chamber was shielded. It was always shielded. The shielding is a core design feature. You can't map fear through static. He pulled up Cadet Marsh's species profile and checked for documented neural variations. There were none flagged. Humans were one of the most thoroughly documented species in the database at that point, 11 years of cadet processing data, over 300 human cadets before Marsh. The species profile was solid. He asked over the intercom, Cadet Marsh, have you taken any medications in the last 24 hours? Any supplements, any sedatives, anything at all? No, sir, Marsh said, same even tone. Are you currently in a meditative state, or using any relaxation techniques? A pause, brief, not intentionally. Dorsal looked at me through the observation window. I looked back at him. We didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say yet. The machine completed its recalibration and began the second scan attempt. The hum in the chamber shifted slightly in pitch. I could hear it through the monitoring room's ambient feed. The second attempt uses a broader neural resonance frequency, covering a wider band of fear architecture pathways. It's more intensive. Cadets sometimes describe the second attempt as feeling more intrusive than the first, like something looking harder for something it couldn't find. Cadet Marsh looked at the ceiling. He shifted slightly in the chair, not with discomfort, but in the way someone shifts when they're settling in for a wait, like he was getting comfortable. I heard Olesa make a small sound under her breath, not quite a word, something between surprise and confusion. At 2 minutes 30 seconds into the second attempt, the display read, processing. At 3 minutes, processing. At 4 minutes, recalibrating. Dorsal used more Krell profanity. I recognized the cadence, if not the specific words. Section 2.3, what Marsh said during the third attempt. The third attempt uses what the technical documentation calls targeted deep resonance. It's more direct than the first two scans. Instead of broad frequency mapping, it directs the resonance at specific neural pathways known to be associated with fear processing in each documented species. For humans, these are well-established pathways: the amygdala response architecture, the memory-linked anxiety networks, the anticipatory threat assessment systems. The Fenrir machine's human-specific targeting protocol is based on over 300 data points collected from previous human cadets. It knows exactly where to look and exactly how to look there. Before Dorsal initiated the third attempt, he opened the intercom again. Cadet Marsh, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I want you to think about something that makes you uncomfortable. Not a phobia, just something that creates a sense of unease. A memory, an idea, a situation, something real for you. Can you do that? The logic here is that an actively engaged fear response is easier for the machine to lock onto than a latent one. Sometimes, with very calm subjects, a gentle prompt helps. Marsh was quiet for a moment, then he said, I'm trying. Good, Dorsal said. Keep trying, we're starting the third attempt. About 40 seconds into the third attempt, Marsh spoke without being prompted. His voice was thoughtful. Is it supposed to feel like something? He asked. Because I don't feel anything. Dorsal said, most subjects feel a mild sensation of awareness, of being scanned. Marsh said, a small, considering sound. Nothing. That's fine, Dorsal said, in the tone of a person for whom things were not particularly fine. Just stay relaxed. I am, Marsh said. He sounded like he was. At 3 minutes into the third attempt, the display cleared completely for the second time. This time, when the new content appeared, it wasn't the word recalibrating. It was 2 lines. The first line was the standard output header, primary fear designation. The second line was the result field. And the result field read, unknown. In the monitoring room, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Olesa said very quietly, that's not a result. That's an error code. And Dorsal said, that's not an error code either. I've seen every error code this machine generates. That's not one of them. He was right, I checked afterward. I went through the complete technical documentation for the PSMAIV. Unknown is not an error code. It's not a diagnostic flag. It's not a calibration notation. It has no defined meaning in the system architecture. The machine had produced a word that didn't belong in its own vocabulary. Part 3, the aftermath begins. Section 3.1, ending the session. Dorsal made the decision to end the session at that point. This was technically within his authority as senior technician, and in retrospect it was the correct call. Continuing to scan a subject when the machine's output has become undefined is not productive and raises welfare questions that ethics board observers take seriously. He spoke into the intercom. Cadet Marsh, thank you for your patience. We're going to conclude the session now. You can exit the chamber. Marsh said, okay, got up from the chair, stretched briefly, the kind of stretch someone does when they've been sitting still for a while, and walked out. He stopped at the door and turned back toward the observation window, though from his angle he probably couldn't see us clearly through the one-way surface. He just stood there for a second, and then he said, Did it work? Dorsal hesitated a fraction of a second longer than was natural before he said, through the intercom, "We're reviewing the data. Thank you, Cadet." Marsh nodded, a single unhurried nod, and left. I watched him walk down the corridor on the external camera feed. He didn't look shaken. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look curious in an anxious way. He looked like a person who had just completed a moderately administrative task and was thinking about something else. I turned to Dorsal. "What do we do with this?" Dorsal looked at the display, which still showed the single word unknown in the result field. "I have no idea," he said. And coming from Dorsal, who had been operating Fenrir machines for 7 years, that was a remarkable admission. Section 3.2, the immediate institutional response. I filed a preliminary anomaly report within 2 hours of the incident. Standard procedure for any deviation from expected protocol outcomes. The report went to 3 recipients: Station Commander Hirulvas, the Training Oversight Committee, and the Technical Development Team at the Centaurian-Velthari Research Consortium that maintained the PSMIV. Within 4 hours, I had responses from all 3. Commander Hirulvas's response was essentially, "Equipment malfunction, investigate and repair, retest the cadet when the issue is resolved." The Training Oversight Committee's response was, "Document carefully, do not share information with the cadet cohort, await technical review." The Research Consortium's response was the most interesting. It came from the lead technical architect of the PSMIV, a Velthari researcher named Vrethsalai, who had been working on psychosensory mapping technology for 30 years. His response was 3 sentences long. "We are reviewing the diagnostic logs you transmitted. Please ensure the original session data is preserved in full without modification. We would like to speak with the cadet." Not review the cadet's file, not run additional diagnostics. The cadet himself, that struck me as significant. I called an informal debrief with Dorsal and Olesa that evening in the technician's office. We reviewed the session logs together. 3 full review passes, checking every data point against the expected output architecture. The machine had not malfunctioned. Every system had functioned exactly as designed. The neural resonance had engaged. The frequency targeting had executed correctly. The biometric monitoring had never flagged anything outside normal parameters. The output processing had run through its full algorithm sequence. The result was simply unknown. The algorithm had scanned, processed, computed, and then produced a result that had no precedent and no definition in its own programming. "What does that mean?" Olesa asked. "It means," Dorsal said slowly, "that the machine found something it couldn't categorize, or it found nothing. And it couldn't categorize nothing either." "How is that possible?" she asked. Nobody answered. That was the problem. We didn't know how it was possible. We weren't sure if it was possible by the rules we understood. And yet there it was. Section 3.3, the next morning. The following morning, while Class 7741's Day 31 testing continued with the remaining 4 cadets, all of whom produced clean, standard readings, I requested a brief informal meeting with Cadet Marsh. Not an official interview, not a formal debrief, an informal conversation which I framed to him as routine follow-up for cadets who had slightly extended session times. I felt it was important to interact with him outside of an official context first, to get a sense of the person rather than the record. He came to my office at 800 hours, on time, not early or late. He knocked before entering, which strikes me as a small thing, but I notice it because many cadets don't, especially after 30 days of training when the institutional formality starts to wear slightly thin. He sat across from me. He looked at my desk, at the wall behind me where I had a small Centaurian chromatic resonance sculpture that shifts color in response to air currents, and then at me. He didn't fidget. "How are you doing, Cadet Marsh?" I asked. "Fine," he said. "A little tired. We had 500 runs this week." "Yes," I said. "How are you finding the training overall?" "Good," he said. "Hard in some places. Better than I expected in other places." "What's been harder than you expected?" He thought about that for a moment, actually thought about it, not a reflex response, but a considered one. "The night exercises," he said. "Not because they're physically difficult, just there's something about operating in the dark that I have to adjust to every time. I grew up somewhere with a lot of dark. You'd think I'd be used to it." I made a note of that, not because it seemed alarming, because it was interesting. And what was easier than you expected? I asked. Interacting with other species, he said. I was worried about that, but people are, everyone's dealing with roughly the same thing. The training is hard for everyone. That makes it easier. I said, can I ask you something about the protocol session yesterday? Sure, he said. During the scan, did you notice anything? Any sensation, any discomfort, any intrusive thoughts or memories? He considered the question. Nothing, he said. I tried to. The technician asked me to think about something uncomfortable. I genuinely tried. I just couldn't find anything that felt like what he was describing. What were you thinking about during the session? Another pause. Mostly I was looking at the ceiling, thinking about the light fixture. It's an unusual design for a station installation. The diffusion pattern is wider than standard, which means the light is more even. I noticed it when I came in. I was thinking about why they'd use that kind of fixture in a scanning chamber specifically. I looked at him. He looked back at me. The light fixture, I said. It's a good design, he said. Very practical, no harsh shadows. I made another note. Part 4, the investigation. Section 4.1, VRETH Solis arrival. The research consortium's lead architect arrived at Vega Station 9 days after the incident. Vrethsala was older than I expected. Velthari aged slowly, and while I had known intellectually that he'd been working in psychosensory mapping for 30 years, I hadn't fully processed what 30 years meant for a Velthari who had started in the field young. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had learned, over many decades, that most things worth understanding take time. He spent 2 full days reviewing the session logs before he spoke to anyone about his conclusions. On the morning of his 3rd day at the station, he called a meeting in the analysis room. Present, himself, myself, Dorsal, Olesa, Commander Hirulvas, and the Training Oversight Committee's observer, a quiet Centaurian named Resyal who wrote down everything and said very little. Vrethsala stood at the front of the room with the calm authority of someone who had been in front of more rooms than he could count. He had brought a portable display unit, and on it he showed us something I hadn't seen before. A complete comparative analysis of the Marsh session data against the full 11-year database of PSMAIV results. The machine did not malfunction, he said. This was his opening line. He let it settle before he continued. Every system performed as designed. The neural resonance engaged correctly. The frequency targeting executed across all identified fear architecture pathways for the human species profile. The processing algorithm ran to completion. The output system produced a result based on that processing. He pulled up the comparative data on the display. In 11 years and 947 sessions across all species, the machine has never produced this output. But I want to be careful about what we conclude from that. The machine produced unknown because that is what its output system generated when its processing could not categorize what it found. That is not an error. That is the system doing exactly what it is designed to do, produce the most accurate possible representation of its findings. Commander Hirulvas said, with respect, its findings were a word that means nothing. Its findings, Vrethsala said patiently, were that the Cadet's fear architecture does not match any category in its mapping library. The word unknown is accurate. We simply have to understand what that accuracy means. Section 4.2, 3 theories. Vrethsala laid out 3 possible interpretations of the unknown result. I am going to reproduce them as accurately as I can, because they remain the most rigorous attempt to explain what happened that I've encountered, even 3 years later. Theory 1, absence. The machine found nothing because there is nothing or nothing detectable in Cadet Marsh's fear architecture. His neural pathways do not produce fear responses in any form the machine can identify. This is not the same as courage. Courage is a response to fear. This would mean something else entirely, a genuine physiological absence of the fear response at the neural level. Vrethsala noted that this is theoretically possible in the medical literature. There are documented cases in several species of congenital or acquired damage to the fear processing centers producing something like this, but that the machine's biometric data showed no anomalies in Marsh's amygdala analog structures. His fear processing hardware appeared intact. Absence is possible, Vrethsala said, But absence with intact hardware is very strange. Theory 2, concealment. The machine found something but was prevented from accessing it. This could happen if the subject had an unusual level of neural regulation. Essentially, if the fear response existed but was so thoroughly managed and suppressed that the machine's resonance frequency couldn't penetrate to the architecture beneath the regulation. Vreth noted that this was also unprecedented in the data, but closer to biologically plausible. Some species are known for high degrees of neural self-regulation. Humans are not traditionally counted among them. The human species profile in the database places them at roughly median on the regulation spectrum. But individual variation exists. If this is concealment, he said, it's a level of self-regulation we've never seen measured in a human subject. Theory 3, misclassification. The machine found something, but what it found didn't fit any existing category, not because the fear is absent or hidden, but because it is structured differently from any fear the machine has been trained to recognize. This was Vreth own preferred theory, and he spent the most time on it. The machine's library, he said, is built from 947 data points across 17 species. It is comprehensive, but it is not infinite. If a fear response is structured in a way that falls entirely outside the existing classification scheme, if it's organized around a principle the machine hasn't encountered before, then the machine would scan it, process it, fail to match it to any known category, and produce unknown. What kind of fear would look like that? Dorsal asked. Vreth was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is the interesting question and the reason I want to speak with the cadet. Section 4.3, the interview. Vreth met with Cadet Marsh the following afternoon. I was present as the station's oversight analyst. The meeting was conducted in the small conference room adjacent to my office, and I had requested that it not be framed as an interrogation or a formal debrief. Vreth agreed. He sat across from Marsh at the table with nothing but a small recording unit and his own hands folded in front of him. Marsh knew by this point that something unusual had happened with his session results. He had been told carefully that his session had produced some anomalous data and that the research team wanted to ask him a few questions. I watched him carefully, neither alarmed by this nor particularly excited. He seemed curious. The mild, calm curiosity of someone who has encountered a puzzle and finds it interesting. Vreth opened with small talk, and the small talk was actually genuine. He asked about Meridian Secondary, about what it was like to grow up on a small fringe installation, about what had drawn Marsh to the GDI cadet program. Marsh answered easily and without self-consciousness. He talked about the ice extraction work on Meridian Secondary with a kind of fond familiarity. Not nostalgia exactly, more like the straightforward warmth someone has for a place that shaped them regardless of whether it was comfortable. He talked about the decision to apply to the GDI program with the same matter-of-fact clarity. He'd wanted to do something that mattered at a scale larger than ice extraction. Then Vreth asked, "Are you aware that you are the first subject in 11 years of the Fenrir protocol to produce an unknown result?" Marsh said, "I figured something like that had happened. Is unknown good or bad?" Vreth said, "We don't know yet. That's what we're trying to understand." "What does the machine normally produce?" "A fear, your specific primary fear rated by intensity, and a secondary map of related anxieties." Marsh nodded slowly, and it didn't find one. "Correct." A pause. Marsh looked at the table. "I wasn't trying to block it, in case that matters." "That's useful information," Vreth said. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Yes." "Are you afraid of anything, in your own experience? Not what the machine finds, what you yourself would name." Marsh was quiet for a long time, not a defensive silence, a thinking silence. I could see him actually working through the question, checking different drawers in his own mind, examining what he found there. "I don't know," he said finally. "There are things I prefer not to happen, things I try to avoid, but when I try to name what the feeling is underneath that, it doesn't feel like what I imagine fear is supposed to feel like." "What does it feel like?" "Like calculation," Marsh said. "Like if this happens, then I need to do this. If that happens, then I need to do that. There's urgency sometimes. But it's more like a problem I'm solving than something I'm running from." Vreth looked at him for a moment in silence. Then he said, "What would happen if the problem couldn't be solved?" Marsh considered this. Then I'd solve the next problem, he said, whatever the next one was. Vrethsala was quiet for a long time after that. Part 5, What We Found. Section 5.1, The Secondary Investigation. After the interview, Vrethsala requested access to every training record we had for Cadet Marsh. 30 days of assessment data, physical performance metrics, cognitive evaluation scores, stress response measurements from training exercises, social interaction logs, behavioral observation notes from instructors. He and I spent an afternoon going through it together. I want to describe what we found, because I think it's the only way the full picture makes sense. Marsh's physical performance was solid but not exceptional. He was in the upper third of his class for endurance, roughly middle of the pack for raw strength, above average for precision tasks. Nothing there that would explain anything. His cognitive evaluations were more interesting. He consistently scored very high, top 5%, on threat assessment and problem decomposition tasks. These are the evaluations that require a cadet to analyze a situation rapidly and identify what needs to happen and in what order. He was fast at those, almost unusually fast. He scored lower, relatively speaking, on emotional response evaluations, the assessments designed to measure empathic response, emotional labeling, the ability to identify and describe one's own emotional states. Not low enough to flag as a concern, but lower than his threat assessment scores by a notable margin. It wasn't that he was emotionally detached. His social integration scores and instructor observations didn't support that. He clearly felt things. He just seemed to have an unusual relationship with the identification and labeling of those feelings. Vrethsala pointed at those numbers. Look at this, he said. Threat assessment, 92nd percentile, emotional labeling, 44th percentile. In most subjects, those two numbers are correlated. High threat awareness typically correlates with high fear and high emotional sensitivity. With him, the threat assessment is high and the emotional labeling is average. Which means, I asked, which means he perceives threats very accurately. He just doesn't respond to them through the fear channel. What channel does he respond through? Vrethsala leaned back. I think, he said slowly, he responds through the problem-solving channel, directly, without the intermediate step of fear. He pulled up a specific training log, an exercise from day 19, a nighttime navigation scenario in which cadets were placed in an unmapped section of the station without equipment and had to find their way back to the central hub using only environmental cues. It was designed to be stressful. Most cadets found it significantly stressful. Several had minor anxiety responses during or after. The log showed that Cadet Marsh had completed the exercise 8 minutes faster than the next fastest cadet. His biometric monitor had recorded no significant elevation in stress indicators throughout. His post-exercise self-report described the experience as challenging and interesting. He grew up, Vrethsala said, on a small fringe installation in the dark outer zone of his home system. Constant low-light environment, limited population, logistical problems as daily life for roughly 18 years. I think he learned very early that fear responses were not efficient. That the most useful thing to do with a threatening situation was to immediately begin solving it. A lot of people grow up in difficult environments, I said. Not all of them end up unknown. No, Vrethsala agreed. But I think most of them retain the fear anyway. The fear is still there, functioning underneath the coping mechanism. It's the combination that's interesting. His fear processing hardware is intact as far as we can measure. But the fear, the actual subjective experience of fear as an emotion, seems to have been so thoroughly rooted around that it may no longer be generating a signal the machine can read. He paused. Or, he said, and this is the interpretation I find most compelling, the fear is there, but it's structured in a way we've never seen before. Not as a primary emotional response that then gets managed, but as a direct cognitive process that never passes through the emotional layer at all. And the machine can't recognize it because it's looking for an emotional signal, and he doesn't produce one. I thought about what Marsh had said in the interview. It feels like calculation. So what do we call that? I asked. Vrethsala looked at the unknown in the data field on his display. I've been trying to name it for 3 days, he said. I don't have a good answer. The closest thing I can think of is functional threat processing without emotional intermediation, But that's a description, not a name, and I'm not sure we should name it yet. I'm not sure we understand it well enough. Section 5.2, the incident that changed MY understanding. I might have stayed in the realm of theory, continued filing reports and observing Cadet Marsh from the monitoring room perspective of my job, if it hadn't been for what happened in Week 6. Week 6 of Class 7741's training included a full scenario combat simulation, an extended live exercise in which cadets were placed into a realistic mission scenario with non-lethal training weapons and actual opposing force actors. The scenarios were designed to be realistic enough to generate genuine stress responses. They were designed to be difficult. Several scenarios included conditions that would generate significant fear responses in most cadets: sudden overwhelming threat, casualty events, tactical situations that appeared hopeless. I observed the simulation from the station's monitoring center, which gave me live feeds from all 43 cadet biometric monitors and the scenario camera network simultaneously. The scenario Cadet Marsh was placed in, along with 3 other cadets, as part of a 4-person fire team, was one of the harder ones. They were tasked with extracting a simulated civilian asset from a contested area while an opposing force of 6 simulation actors attempted to prevent the extraction. The math was not in the fire team's favor. Numerically, tactically, it was designed to be a situation that created genuine pressure. I watched the biometric feeds as the scenario began. Marsh's heart rate elevated to 84 beats per minute. His blood pressure went up. His stress indicators increased. He was not physiologically unresponsive to the scenario. The body was responding to the situation. But where the other 3 cadets in his fire team showed classic fear pattern biometrics, the rapid elevation, the micro-fluctuations that indicate anxious decision-making, the cortisol spike, Marsh's elevated numbers were clean, stable in their elevation, rising and then holding, like a readiness state rather than a panic response. He spoke in the scenario. I could hear him on the audio feed. He was the first in the fire team to speak after contact with the opposing force, and what he said was, "I see 3 of them at the junction. Yellenvo, can you reach the east corner from your position?" He wasn't shouting. He was using the focused volume of someone in a loud environment who wants to be clearly heard. His voice was even. Yellenvo, the Krell cadet who had cried after the Fenrir protocol, said, "I think so," in the voice of someone who is quite frightened. "Good," Marsh said. "Go. When you get there, you'll see the opposing force's sightline is broken by the cargo stack. Wait there. We'll draw 2 of them and you take the junction." Was this the right tactical call? It was good. Not perfect. In the debrief afterward, the training instructors pointed out 2 alternative approaches that might have been slightly more efficient. But it was a clear, confident assessment of the situation that turned what appeared to be an unwinnable scenario into a winnable one. They extracted the asset. 4 cadets, numerically and tactically disadvantaged, against 6 opposing force actors in a design-to-fail scenario. They completed the objective. Afterward, in the team debrief, the instructor asked each cadet to describe their experience during the scenario. The 3 other cadets all used variations of the words scared, frightened, nervous, stressed. They described managing their fear, pushing through it, forcing themselves to act despite the anxiety. Marsh said, "I was focused." The instructor said, "Just focused, nothing else." Marsh thought about it. There was urgency, he said. "I wanted to solve it. I wanted my team to be okay." But he paused. "I don't think scared is the right word for what I was feeling. It was more like something needed to happen and I had to make it happen, so I did." The instructor looked at him for a moment. Then she moved on. "But I kept thinking about it afterward. Something needed to happen and I had to make it happen." Part 6, the deeper question. Section 6.1, what I started to understand. There's a thing that happens in analytical work when you've been looking at a problem for a while and your framing shifts. Where you've been asking one question and you suddenly realize the question was wrong, not because the answer is something different, but because there's a more fundamental question underneath it. I had been asking, what is Cadet Marsh afraid of? After week 6, I realized I should have been asking, what does Cadet Marsh do with a situation that other beings respond to with fear? And the answer to that question was right there in every data point I'd collected. He solves it. He looks at it, assesses it, and immediately begins the process of solving it. Not because he's suppressing fear to get there, not because he's pushing through it, but because that's where his mind goes first. That's the default pathway. Most sentient beings, when confronted with a threatening situation, experience fear first. Then, from that fear, they either flee or fight or freeze or manage. The fear is the initial response, and everything after it is a response to the fear. Marsh seemed to skip that step entirely. He went straight from threatening situation to what needs to happen. The emotional intermediate was just absent, or so thoroughly integrated into the cognitive process that it was undetectable as a separate stage. I brought this framework to Vreth Saleh when he was still on station. He listened to it carefully, turned it over, examined it. Yes, he said, that's what I was trying to articulate as well, but here's the thing that troubles me. He pulled up the scenario biometrics again. His body responds to threat. Heart rate up, blood pressure up, stress hormones up. So the threat is registered. The biology is responding. The emotional layer is just not translating the biological signal into the subjective experience of fear. Or if it is, it's doing so in a way that doesn't interrupt the cognitive process. Is that possible? I asked. I didn't think so before this week, he said. I'm revising that position. He looked at me. Do you know what this reminds me of? Velthari twin-form cognitive architecture. In twin-form Velthari, the two cognitive centers process information in parallel, and the output they receive is already synthesized. They skip several intermediate processing steps that singleton minds go through because the parallel processing handles those steps simultaneously. He's not parallel processing. He's something different. But the end result, skipping an intermediate step that most minds go through, is structurally similar. So it's an efficiency, I said. It might be, Vreth Saleh said. Or it might be a loss, or it might be something that doesn't map cleanly onto either of those categories. He shook his head slightly. I've been in this field for 30 years. I've mapped more fear architectures than most beings in the galaxy. I genuinely do not know what to call this, and I'm not sure the fact that I can't name it means it's a deficiency. It might mean our naming system isn't complete. Section 6.2. What Marsh said when I asked HIM directly. About 3 weeks after Vreth Saleh left the station, I had a final informal conversation with Cadet Marsh. I want to include it here because I think it belongs in the archive. I told him in broad terms what Vreth Saleh and I had concluded, that we believed his fear response was structured in a way the machine couldn't categorize, possibly because the emotional intermediate step, the step where a threat becomes a subjective experience of fear before it becomes an action, appeared to be absent or integrated into the cognitive process in an unusual way. I told him we weren't sure what to make of it. I was honest about that. I told him it wasn't a diagnosis and it wasn't a verdict. It was a finding and an incomplete one. He listened to all of this carefully. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," I said. "Does it matter for the training, for what you're trying to figure out about me?" "Does it matter how you work?" I said. "It matters in the sense that understanding it helps us work with you better. It doesn't. We're not trying to fix it." "I didn't think you were," he said. "I was just wondering what you were going to do with it." "File it," I said. "Write it up, think about it. The machine's results are part of your permanent record." I paused. "Does it bother you to have unknown in your file?" He thought about that. A real pause, a real consideration. "It would bother me more," he said finally, "if the machine had told me something wrong." I looked at him. If it had said, "I don't know," if it had come up with something and it wasn't right, that would bother me, because then the record would say something about me that wasn't true and I'd have to spend time explaining it or correcting it. But unknown, he lifted a shoulder slightly. Unknown just means we don't know yet. That's honest. I can work with honest. I wrote that down. I wrote it down in the moment, which I don't usually do in informal conversations, and I didn't apologize for writing it down because I thought it was important. Unknown just means we don't know yet. That's honest. Part 7, the year that followed. Section 7.1, Class 7741, Graduation and Deployment. Class 7741 graduated from Vega Station 11 months after the intake date. 40 cadets, 3 had washed out of the program at various points, as is usual, received their designations, and were assigned to field postings. Cadet Marsh graduated 7th in his class overall. Not first, He was not the most academically exceptional cadet, and the ranking system incorporates academic performance heavily. But in the practical evaluations, the operational simulations, the team exercises, the judgment assessments, he was consistently in the top 3. His instructors wrote evaluations that used words like reliable under pressure and clear-headed in chaos, and the kind of officer you want making calls when everything is falling apart. One of his instructors, a human senior officer named Captain Delane Voss, wrote something in his evaluation that I want to include here. This cadet does not appear to experience fear in the standard way, if at all. This is not a recommendation against deployment. In fact, I would argue it is a substantial asset. But it is worth noting for supervisory personnel who need to understand how he operates. He will not look frightened when he should be. Do not assume this means the situation isn't serious. It usually means he's already working on it. He was assigned to the Rimward Patrol Command, which was, at the time, one of the quieter postings in the GDI field structure. Routine operations, patrol and observation, nothing that would generate significant incident reports. Within 8 months, Rimward Patrol Command would become one of the most active operational sectors in the galaxy, as the border tensions with the Dithrak separatist movement escalated into open conflict. But that is beyond the scope of this document. What I know is that Cadet Elias Marsh, Officer Marsh by that point, served in that sector throughout the conflict, and that the after-action reports from his commanding officers are consistent with everything I observed on Vega Station. Clear, focused, reliable under conditions that produced fear responses in everyone around him. I read one report 3 months into the Rimward conflict, where his commanding officer described a specific incident. I won't go into full detail. The incident is classified above this document's tier level, but the summary in the unclassified portion read, Officer Marsh identified the tactical solution while under direct fire and directed his unit's response. He remained calm throughout. Afterward, when asked how he had managed to think clearly under those conditions, he said, "It was a problem. I solved it." I don't need to tell you what that reminded me of. Section 7.2, the research implications. Vrethsala published a paper in the Galactic Psychosensory Research Quarterly approximately 14 months after the incident. I'm not going to cite it extensively here. It's available in the academic archive for those with appropriate access. But I want to note its conclusions because they remain the most authoritative analysis of what happened in that chamber. His paper proposed a new category of fear response architecture that he termed integrative threat processing. A cognitive structure in which threat response and problem-solving response are not sequential, but simultaneous and integrated, such that the emotional signal of fear is absorbed directly into the action planning process, without generating a separable subjective experience. He described it as not the absence of fear, but the full metabolization of fear, at a speed and completeness that makes it functionally indistinguishable from its absence. The paper was received with significant interest and also significant skepticism. Some researchers argued that the N of one case, one subject, was insufficient to propose a new category. Vrethsala acknowledged this in his conclusion. He noted that the unknown result was a data point, not a conclusion, and that the full implications could only be understood with additional research. He also proposed modifications to the PSMIV's output architecture to include a new category alongside the standard fear designations. He called it ITP, Integrative Threat Processing, not a fear in the conventional sense. A different relationship with fear, a different kind of architecture. The modifications have not yet been implemented in the official PSMIV systems, as of the date of this document. There is an ongoing debate within the consortium about whether modifying the output categories represents a scientific advance or a premature conclusion. The machine, as of today's date, still would read unknown for Elias Marsh if he sat down in the chair again. Part 8, What I Believe Now. Section 8.1, a personal note analyst VRETHNA, personal addendum. I am aware that analysts are not supposed to include personal notes in classified archive documents. I am doing it anyway because this is my document, and because I think the record should include what I actually think, not just what I can formally prove. I've spent 3 years thinking about Elias Marsh and about unknown. I've thought about it during other protocol sessions, watching the machine work on other cadets, watching it find what it's looking for with the smooth efficiency of a well-designed system doing its job. I've thought about it in conversations with other researchers, in the late hours of long shifts, in the particular kind of thinking that happens when you're not quite awake, and the mind goes where it wants. Here's what I believe. I believe Elias Marsh is not without fear. I don't think the absence interpretation is right, and I don't think Vreth Saleh's integrative processing model fully captures it either, though it comes closer. I think what Marsh has, whatever it is something more like a transformed relationship with fear. Something that happened over 18 years on a cold, dark, isolated station where problems had to be solved and waiting to feel less afraid before you solved them was a luxury that didn't exist. I think fear is there. I think it moved. I think it relocated over years and years of habitual response from the emotional center to the action center. I think when he encounters a threat, his fear, if that's even the right word anymore, manifests not as a feeling of dread but as a compulsion to solve, as urgency, as the immediate, focused need to make the problem stop. And I think the machine couldn't find it because the machine was looking in the right place for the wrong species, or looking in the right place for most members of the species, and for one particular member, the signal had moved. The machine wasn't wrong. Unknown was the right answer. The machine was honest in the only way it knew how to be. And that honesty is why I've preserved this document and this analysis so carefully, and why I'm filing it at the highest accessible tier, and why I think it matters. Not because Elias Marsh is superhuman or impossible or a specimen to be studied. He's not. He's a person. He's a young man who grew up in the dark and learned, without knowing he was learning it, to do something with threats that most minds don't do. And then he walked into a machine that had never met anyone like him, and the machine told the truth. I don't know what this is. That's not a failure. That might be the most important thing the machine has ever said. Section 8.2, a final observation. I spoke with Elias Marsh one more time before he shipped out to Rimward Command. A brief conversation in the corridor outside the Departure Processing Center, while he was carrying a kit bag and looking at the station directory screen for the location of Bay 7. Bay 7 is on the left past the Environmental Systems Junction, I told him. Thank you, he said. He looked at me. You wrote up the report on my protocol session, didn't you? Yes, I said. What did you call it in the end? Unknown, I said. We kept it as the result. It's what the machine said. It's what we know. He nodded that single, unhurried nod. That's fair, he said. He picked up his kit bag. He was about to leave. Then he paused and turned back slightly with the expression of someone who has thought of something that seems worth saying. For what it's worth, he said, I think the machine was doing its best. It just hadn't seen this before. A brief pause. Neither had I until you explained it, so I guess we're both new to it. He walked down the corridor toward Bay 7. I stood there in the corridor for a moment, just standing there. Which is something I almost never do, stand still in corridors doing nothing. But I stood there. We're both new to it. I thought about that. I thought about what it means to encounter something genuinely new. The machine had encountered Elias Marsh and produced its most honest answer. We had encountered that answer and spent months trying to understand it. And Marsh had encountered his own results and received them with the same steady, practical equanimity with which he received everything else. And somewhere in all of that, I thought, was something true. Not a conclusion, not a finding I could write in a results field, just something true. The galaxy is very large. We have been mapping its species, its psychologies, its fears for a long time. And we think we've covered most of the territory. We think the categories are fairly complete. We think we know most of the shapes a thinking mind can take. And then someone sits down in the chair, and the machine, after 11 years and 947 sessions, produces a word it has never produced before. And the word it produces is, I don't know. And that, I have come to believe, is the most important word in any scientist's vocabulary. Not because ignorance is good, but because honesty about ignorance is how you keep going. It's how you keep looking. It's how you find the things that are genuinely new. The machine didn't fail when it said unknown. It grew.